Good morning. So this is our third lecture regarding industrial relations that we were discussing, and in this lecture we will cover this whole chapter because only approaches and various perspectives to study industrial relations remains. Okay. So in this lecture we will cover all the approaches towards study industrial relations, such as sociological approach, psychological approach, systems approach, human relations approach, Oxford approach, and we will study each and approach carefully, and the main motive here is to understand which scholar give what approach and what are the basic details within each approach, so that we can identify each approach in the UPSC EPFO examination. Okay, so first we will start with the psychological approach. See, industrial relations in the last two classes we are discussing is the interrelationship between all the stakeholders that are in the industry. This is the basic understanding that we all must have gotten till now. Okay, so all the approaches will actually give their perspective with respect to these interrelationships. So you will find we'll talk about the same thing, but some different subtle differences are there within these approaches. First, we are discussing about psychological approach. So the basic understanding of psychological approach is that it talks about the relationship between stakeholders that arise out of expectations between them. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's understand. So right now we are studying psychological approach. Suppose there is the employee and there is the employer. They all have discussed regarding wages, working hours, working conditions, and within these three major points, the employee must have various expectations, that his wages must be such that he can feed his family, feed himself, live a very dignified existence, have a decent working hours, and have a safe working condition. The employer must also have expectations that these wages must be in tandem so that this profits continue to grow. If the wages are too much, then the profit will reduce. So he will have perspective and expectations based on these things. So they both have sit together, they both have negotiated that these things, a basic agreement have been reached. And if employer or employee is demanding or expecting much more than what has been agreed, this will in turn change the relationship. Okay, change the relationship. So that is what psychological approach says, that expectations of employee and employer will determine the relationship between them. See, it means the relationship arising out of fulfillment or non-fulfillment of the promises or expectations between the parties concerned. And these expectations, they have a very peculiar term for that, which is similar to psychological contracts. Remember these keywords. Whenever they are talking about psychological approach, psychological contracts is very important, and then we'll talk about who's the scholar. But psychological contracts, expectations between employer and employees. Okay, so these are the key terms. Now we will talk about Who is the scholar? Rousseau, Denis Rousseau. Denis M. Rousseau. She is a psychologist that has coined the term psychological contracts, and she says psychological contracts have two relationships. What are those two relationships? Transactional and relational. Let's understand these two terms in detail and let's see how they do relate to industrial relations. First of all, transactional. All of you who have been reading newspapers for the civil services examination or the EPFO examination must have heard this term, that the relationship between two nations have been transactional since decades. So what do really we mean by transactional? That the relationship do not have converging interest, just the transactions, that if you give me this, I'll give you this. Nothing personal, nothing derogatory, just like a barter system. I want this, so in place of this, the other party will give this. This just transactional relationship. So in an industrial setting, what will be there? In an industrial setting, the employer wants continuity in flow of production, and workers want wages. So they both can sit and come at a compromise that if you can increase wages up to this level, I'll continue to work in a flow manner. So this is just a transaction between these two people, irrespective of having convergence of interests. There is no attachment, it's just transaction. You give me this, I'll give you this. Okay, so this is a transactional relationship. It is a very short-term relationship. There is no motivation. Only motivation is their individual. No collective interest, no collective duty towards the plant, no collective duty towards the industry, and only individual interests. So that is why this is a very narrow concept, or you can say narrow relationship arising out of psychological contracts, PC. Get this? And other relationship is relational. Relational relationship, it also known as partnership. When you become a partner to any company, when you come in partnership with any individual to start a joint venture, you promise to give all your intentions, work towards the benefit of company. This is on the worker scale. Similarly, when management is in partnership, it promises to provide sufficient conditions where workers can work in healthy conditions, workers can have good amount of wage that can cater to their family requirements. In this manner, because the interest of these two stakeholders are converging, so the relationship, as you can say, is a long term, because they not only work for their individual interests, they have gone beyond that. Now they are thinking in terms of the benefit of the company, workers, and the company is going beyond its profit motive and going towards working towards benefit of its workers, its employees. In this manner, we can say this relationship is a long-term, long-lasting and a wider concept than transactional relationship. Okay. As you can see, Millward and Hopkins also said that relational subscale significantly more linked with permanent and loyal employees. Okay. So psychological contracts we've understood, the relationship within psychological contracts we've understood. We can also see the criticism with respect to the psychological approach. It says that it is more theoretical than empirical, it lacks a practical value. Okay. Just remember, psychological approach, psychological contracts, Denis Rousseau. What are the relationship within the psychological contracts? Transactional, relational. Relational is a long-lasting relationship. Transactional relationship is just a short-term, narrow, individual interest relationship. Learn some other scholars also, Millward and Hopkins, and the criticism with respect to the psychological approach, which says that it is more theoretical rather than empirical. Okay. Now we'll go to the next approach to understand the industrial relations. Okay, this is a sociological approach. You can write down the scholar name, Margerison. Okay, sociological approach, as you can see from the name itself, it will be more of related with the social context, and the definition which I will tell you of the sociological approach is the same only, that it talks about the relationship between the various stakeholders of the industry within a social cultural context. Obviously, all the relationship will be determined the social cultural context in which the industry is present. The industry within India will be different. The relationship between the government and the workers, the management and the workers will be different in India as compared to Japan, as compared to Russia, as compared to USA. Because they all have different cultural systems. So let's see some examples. Right now we are talking about sociological approach. Scholar Margerison. The basic idea is that industrial relations, which is a relationship between various stakeholders, it will be based on socio-cultural context, or you can say environment in which the industry is located. So it will vary from India, cross country variation you will see, Japan, States, Russia, or communist state like China. Okay, all these countries and all the industries within these countries will have different industrial relations because the society over there, because the culture over there is different. Let's take some example, or even the history of all these countries, labor history, labor movement history are different. They all have achieved independence based on different tactics. Okay. So obviously their culture is determined differently. Let's understand it a bit more. So in India, we are aware about caste inequalities. And obviously, to cater and to reduce historical caste inequalities, the government have provided affirmative action to correct historical wrongs. That means the government has provided the policy of reservation, in the educational institution, in the government industry, such as PSUs. So the labor policy here is different because some reservation to lower caste were given in PSUs. So obviously the employee relationship has changed because the employer has to follow that, it caters this policy within its employment policy. Okay, so such policies will not be there in USA, but USA, although it doesn't explicitly follow it on paper, but there is a history of racial inequality in USA, racial discrimination in USA. So obviously, while employing its workers, USA will try to have one person from black community, one person from Hispanic community. So, and also to reduce gender inequality. Not only USA, India also want that women should also join the workforce. So these choices, of employment, which is the sole right of management, which is the sole, where the management is the sole authority, is regulated by their social cultural context. So the relationship has also changed. You get this? Each and every country is different in terms of their history. Each and every country possess some individual implicit rules and regulations. For example, the culture of strike, non-violent protests have been an historical feature of Indian labor movement. We have discussed this already in our first lecture. So that thing also determines right now the proper establishment of trade unions in our country. Also talks about how the trade unions act in our country if their demands are not met. So in this manner, sociological approach changes the relationship between these various stakeholders. I hope you get this. Sociological approach, main point is socio-cultural context in which the relationship is existing, and it will automatically change based on the country you'll go. You can also associate Max Weber to this approach. However, we will also study social action theory of Max Weber in the as the last perspective, then you will be able to understand it a bit more. So the next approach is Gandhian approach. Gandhian approach, as you all must have learnt about what Gandhiji was associated with, what Gandhiji taught to Indian people, and how Gandhiji used his methodology of non-violence to achieve Indian independence. And we will use similar attributes of his actions, and we'll able to determine how the industrial relations will come. Gandhian approach. Now you guys tell me, what are the basic Gandhian approach? What are the basic principles of Gandhian approach? If you don't know Gandhian approach principles, just tell me what were the basic tenets of Gandhian philosophy, and I'll tell you his approach based on this. Gandhian philosophy basic tenets. Do tell. Take 1 minute. Obviously it is very easy. First is non-violence. Although the color which I have chosen is inappropriate, I hope so. Non-violence, cooperation, or you can say truth, and last but not the least, trusteeship. Trustee, TR, cooperation, C, and NV. Let's understand each and every term with respect to industrial relations. Okay, non-violence, you all know, prohibition of using violence as a means to achieve any end. Cooperation, we all must sit together to understand each other's interests and just discuss what the issues are and address them. Trusteeship, Gandhi says that the capitalists who are gaining wealth on account of workers' work should not hold all the money. They should distribute that money because they are just the trustee of the society's wealth. They should distribute that money to contribute to society and to improve the conditions of the workers, the employees, through which they are getting their profit. Okay, so these three things are there. Let's understand all three of them in context of industrial relations. Non-violence. Gandhian approach says that use of violence, strikes, gherav, should be used as a last resort. They should be prohibited, and even if they are used, they should be used as a last resort when all the things are not working. So this is the first thing. Second thing, which is cooperation. Gandhian approach says that all the parties, that means all the stakeholders which is employee, employer, government, they must sit together talk, tell each other's interests and resolve them peacefully. Have a social dialogue, have a productive dialogue, represent their issues and address them and address them on the negotiating table. Do not involve in violence. Just sit there, talk peacefully and address your issues. Last but not the least, trusteeship. It says that the management should use profit for the benefit of society, its workers, in order to have a healthy relationship, because then all the people, especially workers, will feel justice being done to them. And we have a very practical example to these CSIR provisions for all industries. Sorry, not CSIR, CSR, corporate social responsibility. And for workers, companies like Maruti Suzuki provide alpha, which is a profit share to all its workers every year, whenever annual figures are. Alright, okay. In this manner, we have understood what the Gandhian approach to industrial relations is. Basic key terms are trusteeship, cooperation, peaceful dialogue, and use of non-violence. Let's go to the next approach. Now we'll talk about the human relations approach. Human relations approach is just like a subset approach where we are going into specific portion. Just remember the key scholar, Elton Mayo, Roethlisberger and Whitehead. Please do remember this. In this manner only you will be able to distinguish between the approaches when these approaches will come in the examination. Okay, and that is the only motive because of which we are learning these things. Okay, let's understand what do we mean by the human relations approach. In human relations approach, the main emphasis is laid down on human motivations. That what does any human want? That workers only want, especially wants a healthy working conditions, good wages, decent workload, work-life balance, and only when these human factors or motivations are catered by the management, the working environment of the industry will be good. Otherwise, if their motivations are not fulfilled, this environment will get compromised and the relationship between management and employee will break. So a management must understand the whole industrial relations from the human motivations point of view. Okay, this is the whole crux of human relationship of understanding industrial relations. This is a very basic approach based on human motivations. Just remember the scholar, remember the approach, and then we'll go to Dunlop's approach. Dunlop we've discussed earlier, that he talked about, he gave the definition of industrial relations in terms of a system. Now we'll understand the Dunlop's approach in a bit detail here. Dunlop is the scholar. Okay. So he talks about industrial relations as a complex interrelationship between actors within an environment. Okay. Because this is a basic generic definition of system too. A system consists of an environment within which the stakeholders are interacting amongst each other. So similarly, he based his theory on similar definition. What are the parts of his system? Let's understand this. Actor, goal, rules, structure, environment. These are the 5 parts of Dunlop's system approach. Actors, we all know: employer, employee, government, trade unions. What are their goals? This we have also discussed. Employer wants profit, employee wants wages, good working conditions, government wants proper law and order, trade unions wants benefits of workers. Rules, the government make rules, code on social security, code on wages, minimum wage law that comes within the code on wages, various laws that have been formed, even the constitutional provisions. These are set of rules within which these actors will interact. These actors will pursue their individual goals under these rules. Okay, so structure means formal, informal structure between these actors. In an organizational setup, MNCs, they have a very formal relationship, but in startups or newly formed companies, they have a very loose structure. So the relationship can get informal. Okay. Lastly, environment. Environment refers to external factors that can impact this whole system of industrial relations. These factors can include global conflicts. For example, this recent Russia-Ukraine conflict have disrupted various supply chain industries, disrupted various industries that are associated with supply chain. Okay. Similarly, technological change, for example, artificial intelligence, how it is changing the current IT industry, which right now are facing various layoffs, where we can see the industries are laying off various employees, and even after the arrival of AI, the low level workers whose work the AI can do easily and very fastly, they'll also be laid off. And then the social issue will create, because these people will have to upskill themselves in order to be relevant in the job industry. So this whole setup in a systematic sense says systems approach, and through this system we can easily understand whatever relationship in the industries exist, because when you say what are goals of employer, profit, working in this condition, this system approach tells everything. See, it caters to each and everything. You get this? And now let's understand that through examples, let's understand what the system approach can do. Suppose strikes are there. This explains the failure of regular functioning of system. Government making policies are acting as a regulator of system. In the third portion we have mentioned about the rules that tells about how the actors will perform and how actors will interact within that constraints put by regulator. Okay, so this approach is known as systems approach. We have learned about the actors, the rules, the structure. We'll also learn a bit about we'll talk about the Oxford approach. Oxford approach emphasized on conflict resolution through collective bargaining. Okay, I'll tell you. First of all, make sure that you learn about the scholar Flanders. Okay, and Oxford approach put an emphasis on conflict resolution. It talks about the relationship between the stakeholders that are employees and employers will be dependent upon how well they can resolve their conflicts. That's why this approach focuses upon collective bargaining. As a methodology to resolve conflicts. Collective bargaining refers to collection of people, that means workers, represented through trade unions and asking and presenting their demands to the management. Okay, collective bargaining, this is a new chapter. We'll talk about this in this series only. However, right now you just take a glimpse that it is a collective representation of workers that provides an opportunity for workers to present their demands to management. Because it is a collective unit, their demands gives more weightage to their. Okay. However, if one worker would have gone to management, the management would have rejected his demands because you're only a minority. But when the whole collective is going, the weightage and the leverage becomes strong. Okay. That's where this Oxford approach talks about collective bargaining as a methodology to resolve conflicts, and when they'll be able to resolve conflicts, the relationship between stakeholders will be just fine and the continuity of production will go on. Now let's talk about theoretical perspectives also. In this we'll talk about the unitary perspective, pluralistic perspective, Marxist perspective and also social action perspective. Okay. Unitary, pluralistic, Marxist and social action perspective. We'll understand each and every perspective through examples. Let's look at this. First of all, unitary perspective. In unitary perspective, the industry is treated as one unit. That means all the management, all the stakeholders, even the workers have a one motive, and that is to make industry as profitable as we can make it possible. They treat whole industry as one single unit, whole company as one single unit, where each and every stakeholder is working in convergence. All are motivated, all are happy, and the issues, even if they arise like strikes, they arise as part of workers' disloyalty or management's lackadaisical attitude towards workers. So it is a paternalistic kind of relationship, a fatherly kind of relationship, where all people, all stakeholders work in tandem, work in cooperative manner. Understood? So this is unitary perspective. It says that all individuals, groups working in industry have a one common interest. I know it sounds very untrue, but that's what the theory says. That's what the theory says. And that's why the major criticism of this theory is that it is too idealistic. Or unreal, impractical. They treat trade unions as unnatural, not needed in unitary perspective. They say that when we are all working in tandem, what's the use of trade union? Why trade unions are needed when we all are working together, when all our interests are converged? So they treat trade unions as unnatural. They don't want it to exist. So this is unitary perspective. Now let's understand the next perspective, which is pluralistic perspective. It is a just opposite perspective. You can say pluralistic perspective. In unitary perspective, we've talked about that all the individuals or groups within an industry have a common interest, but in pluralistic perspective, we say that all individuals have a different perspective with respect to each and everything. All people are different, all have different interests. So that's why industrial conflict is natural. Obviously, because since all people have different interests, so the convergence of interest will not be there, and there will be a clashes of interest, clashes of values, clashes of objectives. So industrial conflicts will naturally arise, and within this perspective, they treat trade unions an essential stakeholder in an organization, because through these trade unions, employees or workers can fulfill their demands, can present their demands to the management in a proper manner, can put their demands to the management in a high leveraged manner that we have discussed in the previous approach, that it talks about collective bargaining. Okay, so we have discussed pluralistic perspective and distinguished it with the unitary perspective. In this, you must learn that what about the trade unions in pluralistic, trade union in unitary. In unitary, it is unnatural. Here, it is an essential stakeholder. In pluralistic perspective, industrial conflict is natural. However, in unitary perspective, industrial conflict is unnatural. It arises out of workers' disloyalty or management's lackadaisical attitude. And this stakeholders' interests, different in pluralistic perspective, similar in unitary perspective. Understood? Now let's move to the next most important perspective, Marxist perspective. Marxist perspective is based on the philosophy of Marxism. And what was the philosophy of Marxism? Can anybody tell? All of you must have heard about Marxism. It's a very famous philosophy, very impactful philosophy. It talks about class struggle. It talks about surplus value. It talks about alienation. It talks about communist revolution. Let's understand these key terms first. When you will understand these key terms, And when I'll ask you to relate these key terms with the industrial relations theory that we have discussed, you'll be easily able to understand what the Marxist approach is. Easy, very easy. Class struggle, Marx says that bourgeois or the capitalist class and the workers' class will always be in a struggle. Why? Because they both have contradictory interests. This is an exploiting class, it exploits the workers, and this is exploited class, exploiting. Marx says this. Okay, you can see there. Marx says this, that the capitalists is an exploiting class, workers are exploited class, and because of contradictory interests of both these classes, they will continue to be in class struggle. Okay, now let's understand the concept of surplus value. Surplus value, whatever worker makes and in whatever selling price the capitalist sells, this, the profit, is known as surplus value. The main motive of the capitalist class is to extract as much surplus value as possible, and for this they'll try to reduce the wages of the workers. That's why the interests are contradictory. Then the concept of alienation. In this, it is usually said that workers work for their fulfillment and dignified existence. But since workers are not making products what they want, and they are making products based on what the industry wants, based on what the management wants to do, them to make, they are not fulfilled. That's why they are alienated from their work, alienated from the society. Similarly, last but not the least, communist revolution. Marx says, since cooperative agreements are not possible with the capitalists, prayers won't do anything. So there is a very peculiar statement of Marx when he says, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. So he asked workers to overthrow capitalism through violent revolution and establish dictatorship of proletariat until its transition to communism, which is a stateless, classless society. Now all of you, please relate these terms with the industrial relations. Please try to do that. I'll explain then. Class struggle. Think about it. Treat them based on industrial relations, stakeholders, involve stakeholders. See class struggle in terms of stakeholders. We will see management workers. Workers want increased wages, management want reduce cost, obviously they'll continue to be in struggle. Marx says this. Surplus value, profits, similar interpretation. Alienation also, because workers are not making what the workers want. Workers are making what the management wants. Workers are only making and only working in a style in which management wants. He doesn't have freedom with respect to anything, not even the work or even the methodology of the work. So workers are alienated. Similarly, last but not the least, Marx says that workers should overthrow the management and establish. There is no establishment in the industry, but the methodology of gaining their rights in Marxist perspective is violent activities, which involves strikes, घेराव, हड़ताल, बंद, okay. And this, in terms of methodology, this perspective is starkly opposite to the Gandhian perspective, which talks about using violence as a means of last resort. Okay, so you'll be able to distinguish between Marxist perspective and the Gandhian perspective. You'll be able to distinguish between the unitary perspective and pluralistic perspective. Okay, so let's learn about the last approach, last perspective, social action perspective. Okay, this is also very easy perspective. Social action perspective, Max Weber. Remember the scholar, please. Only the scholars will help you in the main examination. Okay, in social action, the perspective says the relationship in an industry or the industrial relations will be dependent upon the individual motivations of groups and individuals. Social the action which the individual is taking, the action which the group is taking, the action which the government is taking is based on their motivations. Let's understand this through examples. Suppose the employees have started a trade union, or one employee have joined trade union. It is because this employee thinks that joining trade union will benefit him in terms of wages, in terms of working conditions, in terms of proper life. Similarly, there is another individual who doesn't want to join trade union because he thinks that joining trade union will be disruptive to his career. He thinks joining trade union won't do anything. This is his motivations. So you can see the stark differences between these two same individuals within an employment in a company. Okay. Similarly, this is on the employee level. Now comes the management. There can be two types of management. One says that I'll distribute all my profits, distribute a share of my profits to the workers to gain their loyalty. Another management can be, I'll not share any share of profits and will put all these profits in a new venture that can generate more employment, more jobs and more profits, and the existing workers will not get anything. So based on motivations, industrial relations changed. So it says that action are based on motivations. You get this? Similarly, even the government's action is based on its interest of law and order, of higher taxes, of citizens' welfare. They make codes on wages, codes on social security, and here when they are providing provisions for gig economy, they are also being industry relevant. So that the provisions or the constraints or the rules and regulations under which all the industrial stakeholders are working stay relevant and stay up to date with the reality of the world. Okay. So with this, all our approaches with respect to understanding industrial relations are complete. And let's try to solve some questions. Tell me, which one of the theory is related to Karl Marx? Think in terms of whatever the philosophy of Karl Marx was there, and tell me what should be his philosophy. Non-revolutionary, it is incorrect because he talked about communist revolution, he talked about revolutionary actions to end class struggle and establish a just equitable society. Not even psychological, because here we talked about Denis Rousseau, psychological contracts, transactional and relational relationships. Capitalism, obviously incorrect because Marx's analysis was based on the exploitations of capitalism. Anti-capitalism and revolutionary, these two are in consonance with the Marxist ideology. So the right answer is D. Okay, very basic questions, easy. Now tell me, which of the following approach focused on the types of society in which organization functions? This is also a Marxist perspective, similar, there is nothing new in this. Now tell me, this is a very easy question, you all must have heard this definition in the start. According to which approach industrial relations are social subsystem within economic and political system? Key term, system. Who gave this approach? Dunlop. Okay, so with this, our chapter of industrial relations is complete. With this, we have understood. Let's recap what we've learned throughout this 3 lecture series. We started with the definition of industrial relations, then we went on to the historical aspects of industrial relations, how India's industrial relations developed throughout the years. We started from the mid 19th century, then we talked about the Factories Act, then we talked about how era of modern trade unionism came about with the advent of Russian Revolution, and then we talked about Trade Unions Act, how these trade unions got recognition within the British colonial setup, and then we talked about the basic trade unions that developed in India, All India Trade Union Congress and various other trade unions too. Then we've talked about the causes and objectives of industrial relations. Then we've talked about various definitions of industrial relations. Then we saw the impact of bad industrial relations, what are the causes of bad industrial relations, and last but not the least, we've talked about various approaches to industrial relations, and we've talked about 4 perspectives of industrial relations. In approaches, we've talked in the start by psychological approach. Just learn scholars and the basic understanding. With the basic understanding and with the factual information of scholars, you will be able to do any of the questions with respect to industrial relations. Psychological approach we've done, and then we've done sociological approach, then we've done Gandhian approach, then we've done human relations approach, Oxford approach, and even systems approach. Then lastly, we've done Marxist perspective, unitary perspective, pluralistic perspective, and social action perspective. And with this, our whole chapter of industrial relations has been completed. Now we'll shift to another chapter, which, let's see, what chapter is this? So chapter 3, we'll start with collective bargaining in our next lecture. Okay, we'll introduce the concept, definition, constitutional guarantee, collective bargaining in India, types, essential conditions, characteristics. We'll understand each and every aspect of collective bargaining so that you won't be able to, you'll not skip any questions. You'll complete each and every question asked in the competitive examination. So, thank you so much.